keeping the commitment 24/7.
I come to you for facts. I really appreciate what you and your team do.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Well, hello and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth. Well, with only 2 more days of campaigning before what everybody's predicting will be STARMERGEDDON, today we're going to unpack the UK election in a way that no other media will cover. And today I'm delighted that the Muckrakers is made up of me, Andrew Eborn, but also TNT hosts Taylor Hudak and political editor Basil Valentine. And it's my real pleasure to welcome Taylor on her first day of the Muckrakers. She's going to be joining me on the show regularly, hopefully on Tuesdays and Thursdays from now on. And many of you will be familiar with Taylor. She's been a guest, I think, on several TNT shows. For those of you who don't know, she's an American-Hungarian journalist. She's based in Budapest, Hungary, and she covers issues focused on things like human rights, free speech, health, and law. She also researches, writes, and produces video reports and interviews for The Last American Vagabond. And Basil is a regular who you know, who's all the way back from his little trip into Sweden. I think you're back in Brighton, aren't you, Basil?
Indeed, I am back in Blighty, and it's great to be back in an election week. We're absolutely gripped by the thrill of it all, aren't we, politicos like us, Andrew?
Absolutely. I love it. Well, very interesting. And firstly, Taylor, welcome along to the Muckrakers. It's a joy to have you. You're in Budapest, and I'm always interested when we have people who are not based in Britain to see how the election's being reported over there. What's the latest in Budapest about the British election?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I am delighted and honored to be a part of this program on Tuesdays and Thursdays and to be a part of this community with TNT. As you said, I've been on multiple programs here. It's always a joy and always a place to speak the truth and have discussions on topics that you really don't hear about or can talk about anywhere else. Now, I must say that the media coverage about the UK elections in Hungary, I haven't seen too much coverage about this. I must say, as we have a lot going on in our own country, which could perhaps be relevant to what's going on in the UK. I know that obviously the UK is no longer a part of the EU, and I was quite surprised to see that on the official poll data, this in fact seems to be an issue that's not really of great concern to UK voters. There seems to be a lot more that is of concern to the voters with regard to specifically what's going on at home domestically, specifically with regard to the cost of living crisis that you have. And I have traveled to the UK several times. I do not have any other connection to the country besides working there, reporting there on the Julian Assange case, and spending quite a bit of time in London. And I know that it is true. Cost of living is high. Prices are going up. People are dissatisfied with that. They're dissatisfied with the current government. And I think this is really a situation of we have 2 main candidates here, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and both of them, I would say, are deeply unpopular. Please correct me if I'm wrong, either of you on this, but I get the sense that Keir Starmer is actually not too popular, but Rishi Sunak is even less popular. And so we're sort of stuck in this situation. It reminds me somewhat of 2016 in the United States when you had Trump and Clinton, who had quite a few enemies, were not well liked initially, I would say, by the public, were rather unpopular candidates, and they both were able to rise to the top and eventually be the 2 people to run for the 2016 election. So I do see some similarities here, and I am very curious what is going to happen on Thursday, this upcoming Thursday, July 4th, and what that will mean for the UK and how that could have an impact on other countries nearby.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, a lot of people are predicting, as they say, STARMERGEDDON, and I predict that at least one major national newspaper will steal my headline, but STARMERGEDDON is undoubtedly on its way. But you do make an interesting point, Taylor, because you talk about there's not really much coverage in Hungary about the UK election, but I bet there's an awful lot about the American one. Is that right?
Perhaps. One thing that I did notice, though, is that there is an interest with in American politics by people who are living in or are based in the UK in particular and in Europe, which is so interesting to me because I lived in the United States for pretty much my entire life. As I said, I'm now based in Budapest. And to me, it's normal to me. It's sort of a boring process, I would say, the US election process, but it does generate a lot of interest. And I do understand that it could have an impact on people in other countries, given the direction of U.S. foreign policy. And the U.S. sort of sets the stage for how other world leaders will react when it comes to foreign affairs and engaging in other conflicts around the world. So I think that right now in Hungary, which will probably be a discussion for another day, we happen to be enemy number one, let's say, of the EU right now, also now heading the EU presidency, which is very interesting. I saw this news just a few days ago. Of course, it's on a rotating cycle. But again, we could talk about that perhaps another day. But I think that the situation going on in the UK really does set the stage for how other countries will react. And that specifically goes with regard to UK foreign policy. And if it puts into power a leader who wants to continue, let's say, this ongoing conflict in the Ukraine, and if they want to continue to, let's say, antagonize Russia, I think that does sort of empower other countries to behave in a similar manner. Of course, there is some pushback on this issue, in particular Hungary, which has kind of gone against the official line on this, against the EU, against the UK as well. So I think that the outcome that we will see on Thursday could have impacts, ripple effects in broader Europe.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is interesting seeing the press coverage with 2 days to go, and a lot of the press are going on party lines, usual predictable thing. But the Daily Mail is leading on something, and their headline is Britain's defence forces are not ready for conflict of any scale. And this is a chilling conclusion and warning by an ex-Ministry of Defence chief, basically saying Labour's spending, there will be a shortfall, and their plea is don't leave Britain defenceless.
This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers. Me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by the wonderful Taylor Hudak and also the Basil Valentine, who's hidden his microphone now. Well, people are a bit worried by that. They're all texting in appropriately. We're analysing the UK election and just wondering if this is the worst election in the last 50 years. Party lines, it's been very simple, hasn't it, for Project Sunak, if you like. He's working on the basis of fear. It's the strongest human emotion, and the father of PR, Edward Bernays, he said, if you want to persuade anyone about anything, make them scared. And that's what he's saying. We're making progress. And if you change horses now, then basically we're going to stop that progress. Starmer, on the other hand, is talking about change. It's all about change and working on that sort of basis. You've got to change. We've had 14 years of terrible Tories, and this is what we can do to make it different.
Sunak is actually touring constituencies with substantial Conservative majorities in places like the West Midlands, hoping to hang on to seats that they won with 11, 15 or 20,000 votes last time. He's not attempting to even defend the marginals, which they reckon they've already lost, but they're going to try and hang on to the rump of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Remains to be seen how successful he is in that mission.
And it has been extraordinary when we talk about it being the worst general election campaign in 50 years. There's been all sorts of things. I did predict it was going to be around July the 4th, as soon as those inflation figures got better, because you remember that Sunak had his 5 pledges, of which the easiest one was about inflation. He said he'd get that down to half of what it was. Well, that was easy when it was at 11%. And when it went down to 2.3%, and now 2%, basically he was onto a winner. So it's a good time to trigger the election. His timing of it, however, as far as the weather was concerned, was appalling, because there was this terrible thing of a downpour. I don't know if you saw this, Taylor. He had a downpour where he looked like a drenched rat, I think, to the strains of "You Can Only Get Better." Obviously, the headline was going to be "You Can Only Get Wetter," or "You Could Hardly Get Wetter" as a result of it. And it was an appalling start. But there's also been a campaign basically plagued with suggestions about people betting on the election date and revelations about that. There have been all sorts of deep fake videos which have come out, again, as I predicted, about AI and so on and so forth. And we've got all sorts of people trying to put down Nigel Farage and the various other parties on that sort of basis. What were we going to say, Basil?
Well, I was just going to say, the timing, you thought July the 4th, all my money was on an autumn election, because the only chance the Tories had was to wait and hope that the economy improved as the year wore on. An ambush can be a very effective tactic in warfare, but not when you ambush your own troops, which is what Sunak did. It appears, the entire parliamentary Conservative Party were wrong-footed by this. A lot of them absolutely furious, which is no way to start an election campaign. I was extremely surprised that he went for this snap election. Conspiracy theories swirling, of course, because Macron did the same thing, and he seems to have shot himself not simply in the foot, but in the head. Why did both the French president and the UK Prime Minister dissolve their respective parliaments when their own popularities were at record lows? It's never been done before.
Taylor?
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. And I know that we do live in this world, I would say, of a left versus right paradigm. But if you look at the actions and the behaviors of the different candidates and what happens in these different governments, despite the fact that they may be of a different political party, I think it really is very similar. And I think that hopefully one day, it'll take probably many years, but hopefully one day we could get out of this left versus right paradigm. It's the world that we do exist in right now, especially in the United States. We have, vicious confrontation between those on the left and the right. But I think that it does nothing to really serve the people and the voters. Of course, we have differing ideologies and perspectives, but I would say it's really one class of people against another, perhaps. But with regard to the elections, and I want to just go back to briefly here, EU elections, of course, if you look at the media coverage here, you'll see the weaponization of this left versus right paradigm to really spoil people's interpretations of what happened in the EU elections. Everybody is referred to as far right. They're saying sweeping wins for far right leaders, politicians throughout Europe. And it's very interesting to me because a lot of the policies that are advocated for by those now on the so-called far right are former leftist ideas. We also have a situation, not just in Europe, but in the United States, where you have many Republicans or conservatives who are advocating for an end to spending and weapon shipments to Ukraine, whereas you have many Democrats who are supporting this. Of course, there are still people on both sides who very much support the escalation of this conflict. But I think these labels, it really goes to show us that they are virtually meaningless over time. And I think that when you look at some of the problems that the UK is facing, and this really goes to its economy overall, I don't know if this can be necessarily resolved through an election. And I'm really looking at the banking system in the UK, and I'll keep it on topic and make it relevant to the election. But look at the system in the UK. You have 5 main banks. You don't have small community banks, which would be more likely to lend to small businesses, SMEs, small to medium enterprises, which will create jobs, which will create growth, which, by the way, is a good thing, contrary to what those who advocate for net zero would say. This is how economies thrive, and you don't have that in the UK. You have big banks that only lend to big businesses, big corporations. And so it's no wonder that nobody would want to start a business in the UK, that there isn't a flourishing economy there. And perhaps somebody could be in power, could be in office, that could create an environment in which change could start to happen to lead to economic prosperity. But I think that there are some more fundamental changes that perhaps need to take place.
You make an excellent point. It is something we will do a deep dive into here on the Muckrakers, because I very much believe the same, that actually we need the community banks, because banks are just intermediaries. And what's happened is a lot of economists are sort of writing them out in the future of the world economic side. But we will come back to that on the Muckrakers.
Quickly, Andrew.
Go for it, Basil.
For the first time ever, housing has actually moved right up the list of election priorities, certainly where the electorate are concerned, because of the impossibility for young people of getting on the housing ladder. Yeah. And banks are one of the barriers to that. They say, You know, how can you prove that you can pay an £800 a month mortgage when these people are paying double that in rent? But because they can't afford the deposit or whatever, they can't get on the housing ladder unless they've got the bank of mum and dad or somebody to act as a guarantor for the mortgage. So there are these various log jams in the British economy, which are causing knock-on social problems, as Taylor said. And for all her faults, and I really couldn't divide her, but at least Margaret Thatcher was in favour of an enterprise economy and encouraged people to start businesses. I mean, in fact, starting your own business was factored into the job seekers programme in the 1980s and 90s. I'm not sure that it is now. We seem to be moving into an era of corporatism, which the Labour Party are only going to add to.
You make an excellent point. I mean, it's very much we want to make things aspirational, and a lot of the campaigns this time are focused on getting people off benefits and into work because they'll feel more self-worth and so on and so forth. But there's always an interesting comparison between the US and the UK. In the US, they celebrate success, and over here in the UK, we seem to resent it. What's your perception, Taylor?
That's so interesting. You know, that does sort of crack me up in a way, because I have noticed in the United States, and I'm not saying one culture is better than the other, but there are differences. Europe, I would say, generally has a more collectivist viewpoint, whereas the United States very much values individuality in the individual. But what also comes with that too is that you don't have a lot of social programs that help people. We do have some, of course, in the United States, but the culture in the government is structured certainly in a different way. And again, not to get too off topic, but you definitely saw that with, say, COVID restrictions. People in Europe, I think, and I know that the UK is not technically Europe, but people in this area of the world more likely to, I would say, police one another and patrol their behavior. But if you go to the Midwestern United States, it's just not the attitude that people had. People did not want to, or they just did not police each other on these matters. But again, to go back to the UK election, you bring up George Galloway, Basil, which I think, you know, his election campaign, I think it was February of this year, was quite interesting. I think this was a historic victory for him. And I think this also may point to the rise of more alternative parties within the UK that are getting a lot of traction and a lot of enthusiasm. So specifically those, I would say, who are on the left in the UK, who are just not feeling that they are being represented well by the Labour Party and the other left-leaning, the major left-leaning parties. They're looking to the Workers' Party for Britain and looking at those candidates. George Galloway won a huge victory. I believe that he did actually win overwhelmingly also against other establishment candidates by a large margin. And people are in particular very unhappy with Labour, with their stance on Gaza and Israel and the genocide that continues to go on in that region of the world. Of course, not all MPs have been, Labour MPs have been, let's say, bad on this issue, but I think that people are looking to other parties for answers. And I expect that we perhaps will see some more of that in the future. And then you have the equivalent, perhaps, with the Reform Party in the UK. People are dissatisfied with the Conservatives. They feel perhaps that it's not a true alternative to Labour Party. Again, going back to the point that I said earlier, which was that I feel that these two major parties, I know that there's many in the UK, unlike the United States, but the two main parties are quite similar in many ways. And so perhaps those who are conservative, who really want something different, are finding some interest, and they're resonating with the messaging coming out from Reform. So I'll be curious if either of you have noticed that or picked up on that as well. But that's how I see it from an outsider's perspective.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by the wonderful Taylor Hudak and also Basil Valentine. We're dissecting a deep dive into the general election. And I was very interested. Just before the break, I talked about trust and live betting on it. At the moment, the odds, and there's a lot of people putting bets on this particular election, some a bit illegally, and that will be investigated. But at the moment, the odds of Labour getting the most seats are 1 to 66. So that means but basically, the Reclaim Party, getting the most seats, 100 to 1, Reform 100 to 1, but the Conservatives 150 to 1. So in other words, more seats, you're more likely if you're a Reclaim Party, Reform Party to win according to the bookies than you are for the Conservatives. Why have the Conservative Party collapsed so dramatically, Basil?
I think it's been a combination of things, Andrew. To go back to those odds, it's even money with Sky Bet that the Conservatives end up with between 50 and 99 seats. So not even making it to 100, even money. It's only 7 to 1 that they get between 0 and 49 seats, which would be a historic wipeout. So, all the predictions are that this is going to be the worst night in 200 years for the Conservative Party. I think it's a combination of things. Boris Johnson was a popular and charismatic figure for all his faults, and they are legion. And he's not leading the party into the election. Of course, he was forced to resign. So was the Conservatives' second choice, Liz Truss. So they've ended up with a third choice Prime Minister who is richer than the king and completely out of touch with ordinary people. I mean, his comments about having to go without Sky Television so that his parents could afford the school fees to Winchester. I mean, it really is absolutely breathtaking stuff. If it came from an aristocrat, you would say, well, this is indicative of how the British ruling class are completely out of touch with people. In fact, his parents, of course, were Asians from Kenya, and his father was a GP and his mother ran a pharmacy. But he himself married into a billionaire family through his wife, Ms. Murty. So he's completely out of touch. The economy was crashed by the whole COVID farrago. There hasn't been any improvement in living standards for ordinary people. And they realise quite rightly that the Conservatives simply don't want to do anything radical enough to improve the lives of ordinary people. They made a bit of a hash of Brexit. Enormous impact on small businesses. A friend of mine runs a superfood export business, and a third of his business disappeared overnight with Brexit and has really struggled to recover that ground. So, all the arrows are pointing in the wrong direction. Plus, of course, the thing that the Labour Party is trying to tap into with its Orwellian titled manifesto, simply emblazoned with the word change, is that people want to change. We've had 14 years of the Tories. Time's up. It's even, it's as long as the Thatcher era now. So, it's time to change the window dressing and the dummies in the shop window.
Taylor?
Yeah, very interesting points. Again, this goes back to why I said earlier that I felt that, and I could see as an outsider's perspective, that this is absolutely a big moment in the UK as the Tories, the Conservatives, have been in leadership in some form, either with the coalition with another party. They have been in power for 14 years, and it seems that there could be some changes that we see here. As far as the reason for Conservative parties, or the Conservative Party rather, collapsing is, again, I think because people are looking to these alternative parties for answers. They're upset with the status quo. They're not happy with how things have been going with regard to the economy. I think people are also quite upset with changes to the NHS, perhaps privatization of the NHS. This also is a concern on the official polling data for UK voters. So I think it's that. I think also with the cost of living being so high and just the overall aesthetic in the UK. I've spent quite a bit of time in London, as I said, in the city. It's a beautiful city, beautiful buildings, wonderful people, but the city's just not well taken care of. And of course, I will also acknowledge that the United States is known for not having the greatest of infrastructure. We don't spend a lot of money on it compared to other nations. So I just want to point that out so I don't seem hypocritical, but it is not a well-kept city. So I think that the overall mood is not a very good one right now. People want change. People want to see something else. And I think a lot of people are also leaving the UK because they are so dissatisfied with the current government. And there have been people who have been looking to places, believe it or not, like Eastern Europe. And that's mainly, I think, because of the differences in our foreign policy approach, and that has been attractive to some people with a certain political ideology. But again, I think that distrust overall for politicians has been in decline for several years, and very recently in particular. And I also do wonder, though, if the changing media sphere has contributed to that. We know that people are not going to the 6 p.m. News every single day like they did 20, 30 years ago. They're going to their phones. They're going to alternative media, new media like TNT, where they can get differing perspectives, and they're becoming more aware of the reality of this situation that we face. And so that's reflected, I think, in the overall distrust of politicians who have honestly failed us time and time again. And I think this also speaks to a broader point that we are also responsible for the decisions that we make. We can choose what we would like to fund, how we would like to spend our time. Yes, we can also vote, participate in elections, but there are things that we can do as individuals to help take charge of our own lives, so we're not dependent on these political figures, and that we don't see any of them as saviors who are going to save us, that is. So I think that people are just generally having an ideological shift on both sides, or all sides of the political aisles.
You make an excellent point, and very timely, actually. We have a lot of brilliant comments, as always, from our wonderful audience. Jane Black says we have to drop the idea that someone is going to save us and drop our political bias and look at it from a different perspective. She also quotes, whoever can conquer the street can conquer the state. That's obviously a quote from Joseph Goebbels. So you have a look at that sort of side. So you're right, trust in politicians is at an all-time low. And it has been, as we touched on earlier, an extraordinary swing. The election beforehand, the Conservatives came in with an 80 seat majority, and Boris was lauded as the great saviour, if you like. He was the politician who could reach parts of the electorate that others couldn't. The Carlsberg politician, I think they called him. He's now turned into this Marmite character, and it's been a massive swing, potentially the biggest swing in history. What I've also loved on the Muckrakers is that we've had people from all sorts of parties. Yesterday we had Reform together with the Workers' Party, George Galloway's party, and actually they agreed on an awful lot. And I saw that George Galloway came out and suggested that Nigel Farage and George himself should have a debate, you know, the rebels debate, if you like, the alternative side. But there's been a massive rise in those sort of parties. Why do you think that is, Basil?
Well, you know, quite rightly, people can't stand this neoliberal authoritarianism that both wings of the Uniparty represent. Couple of points to pick up on. First of all, the Tory campaign. I've been looking at the Conservative Party website. It is absolutely abysmal. If you gave me £100 and a login to GoDaddy, I could produce a better website by tea time this afternoon. It really is abysmal. It's primary school level stuff, quite frankly. You know, the buttons, the content, absolutely derisory. You know, security, making Britain secure in an uncertain world. And we get a total of about 45 words. So it's not surprising that they're floundering, really, when they can't even get a decent website together. The overall standard of debate this time round has been abysmal. At the moment, this morning, the parties are arguing about Starmer's saying that he still wants to go and watch Arsenal Football Club, that he may get a dog, and he plans to finish work if Prime Minister is at 6 p.m. And he's been attacked for this as being a Workshire, not possessing the necessary work ethic to be Prime Minister. That's where we're at this morning. It's really the lowest standard of debate that I can remember, particularly when we've got these big foreign policy questions that, you know, two wars, the potential for World War III in Eastern Europe unless we wise up. And yet international affairs seem to be completely absent from the debate.
But there's been a lot absent from the debate. I mean, lots of questions. There's been a conspiracy of silence, for example, about how they handled COVID on both sides of the parties and forcing people into lockdown. And what we've been looking at is differences around the world. We talked about Sweden beforehand, who didn't lock their citizens up. They didn't turn around and stop them getting educated, going to school, or stop them eating in their restaurants, and their results were much better. What was the situation where you were, Taylor?
Yes, it's a really good question. And it seems from what you both have said that this is not something that's discussed too often this upcoming election cycle. But I think that, again, both major candidates, I know that there's more than just two, but both of them, Starmer as well as Sunak, I think we're very much in favor of the lockdowns. And it's ironic, in my opinion, to hear someone like Starmer say that he fully supports the working class and workers, yet advocated for lockdowns and these restrictions, the closing of businesses, because this, of course, only hurt those very people that he claims to support and want to uplift and advocate for. And it's a little unnerving to think about, say, if we were to experience another so-called pandemic and these restrictions are attempted once more, are any of these leaders going to stop this? It's doubtful, really. It's doubtful. And I know that, or I think based off of the research that I've done, is that Nigel Farage is the only candidate who would advocate for exiting the WHO. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding at this time. I think that would be a good thing. This needs to be discussed further, because this issue with COVID is something quite significant, because what you have now is you have people who are vaccine injured, who are going to be dependent on the healthcare system for quite a while. You're going to have their family members, friends, their loved ones who are going to be having to take care of them. Of course, this isn't everybody, but a lot of people. It's happening now. I expect the rates of disability to go up. I think they have gone up in the United States, and that correlates with the vaccination campaigns. That will have impacts on the economy as well. If you have a group of people, many of them who are extremely unwell, able to work, contribute to society. So I know a lot of people want to put aside this issue of COVID-19. Trust me, I don't enjoy talking about it that much myself either, but there are lasting impacts, whether that be psychological, very much health impacts with regard to the vaccination campaigns. And we need to ensure that this does not happen again. So I would be very interested if what these candidates would say in response to some questions on this matter. And I would love to see, by the way, you mentioned a potential debate between the two alternative or two politicians of alternative parties, George Galloway and another gentleman. I mean, I think that would be of interest to British voters and very much necessary. And hopefully we'll see that sort of thing in the future.
I think that'd be great. Basil?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, the likes of Galloway in particular have been shut out by the media. Nigel Farage gets a lot of airtime. George Galloway, only a tiny fraction of it. That's because he really put the wind up the establishment with his win in Rochdale in February, where an independent called David Tully, a local garage owner, came second to George Galloway. And Mr. Tully got more votes than Labour and Conservative combined. Yes, the chap who came second in Rochdale got more votes than Labour and Conservative combined, quite apart from George Galloway, of course, as the runaway winner. Now, if I was a conspiracy theorist, I might suggest that that's one of the reasons why we're having this early election. It's in order to wrong foot the minor parties, the Reforms, Workers' Party and Independents of this world, because they haven't had the time to get the ground organisation together, the canvassers, the people knocking on doors, to make as much of an impact as they would have done with an autumn general election. George's party were planning on fielding 300 or 400 candidates, enough to form a majority government. I think it might even be more. I think they had 500 or 600 from my conversation with Chris Williamson, the deputy leader. But they only managed actually now, because of the very short time lead available, to get people registered and do some degree of vetting. The Reform, of course, have had all sorts of problems with some of their candidates who weren't fully vetted. People then go through their social media history and discover that they liked the wrong thing. Oh my God, crime of crime. You clicked a like on something. Anyway, interestingly enough, X have now made liking private. So you can now like what you like and you won't be hauled over the coals for it. But anyway, you're back to the main point. The Workers' Party only managed to get about 150 candidates together in the very short time available. And of course, the very strict election rules for broadcasters means they've had very little airtime. And they've also been ignored by the pollsters, which basically means that if somebody, to start with, when the pollster asks a voter, are you going to vote for party A, B, C, D, or E, doesn't mention the Workers' Party. And then they, as a result, they don't feature in opinion polls. And then people think, oh, they've got no chance, so they don't vote for them. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the cards, quite apart from the first past the post system, the deck is heavily stacked against the smaller parties in Britain. And that's not good for democracy. Keir Starmer, of course, only a few years ago said he supported proportional representation. Now it looks like first past the post is going to hand him a thumping majority. He's against it.
And STARMERGEDDON, I predict that somebody will be using that headline very, very soon. That's all we've had time for today on the Muckrakers. Thank you very much for Taylor and for Basil for joining me. I'll be back with you same time tomorrow. See you then.